Hello, everybody. I'm Sean Reynolds from Sportsnet, about to be joined by Ken Wiebe from the Winnipeg Free Press. Together, we are Kenny and Renny, and this is a Kenny and Renny pop-up version after some just explosive news. I think the word I used to Ken was I was gobsmacked by this. I think a lot of people are going to know it already. Some people have been pointing out, not only when Adam Lowry was named the captain, did I start up a thread on Mark Scheifele saying the idea that Mark Scheifele at one point, there was conversations that he maybe should have been the captain, named the captain when Blake Wheeler was named the captain because he was the future of the franchise. I think there was always an assumption at some point he was going to end up in that role, and for Adam Lowry to end up there, I think it made it fairly clear that that's probably not in the cards. Winnipeg Jets captain Mark Scheifele. Who knows if today's news changes that? I doubt that, but I thought at the time that was just one more tick in the box that said, will he or won't he stay? A tick in the box of he's not going to stay. I was very, very confident. I thought that Mark Scheifele was going to stay, and far more confident that Connor Hellebuyck was not going to be staying as well. And yet we have this absolute bomb dropped today before the season starts. Mark Scheifele and Connor Hellebuyck, each of them inked to 7-year extensions, each getting paid $8.5 million in identical contracts. It's going to be interesting to get into the details of the trade protection and all the little things that go on behind the scenes there, because I already know where a lot of people are going with this about the idea of them being locked down. Now, does that actually make them more tradable? I think a lot of people are going in the direction of like, hey, it's not exactly a sign and trade, but you got to do the sign before the trade, even if some deals are a sign and then immediately trade. We'll explore all that. But one thing that is just absolutely evidently clear to me is Kevin Scheifele, like him, love him, hate him, whatever, dislike him, however it goes in your mind. And, you can argue all day the success that he's had with the Winnipeg Jets over that time, some of the moves that he should have made, shouldn't have made. I know that there's a lot of people and pundits out there who think that there's maybe no more GM on the hot seat heading into this season than Kevin Scheifele. And who knows what this move does to alleviate that. If there's not success this year, will that alleviate that? That's something to be talked about, but the ability for Kevin Scheifele to surprise remains strong. I find this a surprising deal, and beyond that, I think the idea that Connor Hellebuyck most certainly was signed to $8.5 million is something that, you can tick alongside the box of, stars that got inked to really great deals. Mark Scheifele's first contract, Kyle Connor's contract, Nick Ehlers' contract, go up and down the list. You take a look at what Rasmus Dahlin was just paid, and you take a look at what Josh Morrissey has been getting paid. The one thing, you are supposed to overpay to get stars and players to stay in a market like Winnipeg, and Kevin Scheifele for the most part. And we'll get into the value of these contracts. Some people may disagree, but I think you take a look, far more often than not, Kevin Scheifele seems to sign his stars and get them that a number that is more reasonable that you would expect on average, and way more reasonable that you would expect in a market where players are supposedly supposed to be paid to stick around. That's just my opening soliloquy. Lots to get to with this, and the best way to do that is by bringing in my main man, Kenny Wiebe. Here comes the man with the best music in the business. Here comes Kenny.
Whoa!
Ken Weeb, my main man, I said gobsmacked. I think that you were maybe a little less gobsmacked than I was. There's certain things that Ken may have seen that maybe he saw something like this coming. I don't know how much he's willing to share with you, but even you, Ken, I would think maybe if you take Ken from 2 months ago or maybe even 2 weeks ago, would be a little surprised to hear about today's news.
Yeah, no doubt about it, Sean, and thanks for taking the time. We know you're in transit here, so we did our best. Great hustle through security at the airport. Sean's on his way to see Connor Bedard's debut against Sidney Crosby and the Pittsburgh Penguins. Definitely am surprised by one thing. I'm surprised that the Jets were able to get both players to lock down before the season even starts. I had been feeling more recently like Mark Scheifele was becoming more and more of a possibility. First and foremost, because of what we know about the Jets' organizational depth down the middle, and that's, to take nothing away from guys like Brad Lambert and Chaz Lucius, who are still high-end prospects. But when it comes to NHL-ready players that could slide into a number one center role, Mark Scheifele remains the Jets' best option, and that's why they opened up their discussions with him. When it comes to Hellebuyck, surprise is an interesting... I'm surprised based on what he said during his availability with us, but it's another reminder, Sean, that the availabilities with us don't always reflect how players feel, and sometimes when you try to read between the lines, maybe there. I don't think we missed anything, Sean. We were looking for answers. We didn't get a whole lot of them, other than Connor was focused on the present, and now being focused on the present means he's also focused on the future. So massive day for the organization. And Sean, I think this will be a monumental day when we look at the historical films, to borrow a Connor Hellebuyck special. This is a massive day for Kevin Cheveldayoff, a guy who some people weren't sure about his job security. Well, in the last 3 months, he has made a successful trade for P.L. Dubois. He has signed the first ever draft pick in franchise 2.0 history, and he has signed the franchise goaltender to a 7-year deal when most of us, including you and I, had him basically out the door prior to March 9th, unless the Jets chose to roll the proverbial dice and say they got their value out of their 5th round draft pick in 2012 and decided to spit in the face of asset managers and just go for it. So the biggest question about this Jets team, Sean, going into the year was what would happen with Hellebuyck and Scheifele. And on October 9th, we have that answer. And for those folks projecting sign and trade, I'm sorry, that this is not sign and trade material. Sign and trade is for players who can only get an 8th year with their current team, and these are 7-year deals. So yeah, I understand their ages could make some impact on that, but the Jets signed both of these players for one reason and one reason only: for them to be lifelong Jets, for them to break into the NHL as Jets and to retire as Jets. That's not to say that eventually guys can't be moved, but the Jets made these deals on this day for them to be lifetime Jets, for them to retire Jets. And Sean, one thing we've known about Mark Scheifele from the very beginning, and he said it no matter whether the folks decided to listen or not, his favorite player is Steve Yzerman. His favorite player spent his entire career with one organization, and now Mark has the same opportunity to do so. And this is something you and I have spoken about privately, and I may have brought it up once or twice on the show or not, but this in some ways is tied to Dale Howardchuk in terms of Mark's influence that he had from Dale. I think that Dale got to a point later on in his career where he realized how great that he had it in Winnipeg, and I think he wished he had spent his entire career in Winnipeg, and now Mark has that opportunity to do so, and I don't think it would be an accident to suggest that that might be something that Dale whispered in Mark's ear in one of their final conversations together.
I think it's a interesting point about the lifelong Jet thing, because essentially what you've done is you've taken, I mean, this would be what the Winnipeg Jets wanted all along. They wanted to step up there and make a splash with their first ever pick. We go back to that draft, 2011, Mark Scheifele, a player that somewhat went off the board. The Jets were confident with it. It established a style of drafting that they would follow and have followed ever since, in where they weren't afraid of taking big swings. They really like to take risks on guys that looked like maybe they weren't ahead of where other guys were at the draft, but thought they saw a steeper climb for those players. Scheifele's kind of been the ultimate example of that. They did it right out of the gate, and that's what they wanted. How long have we heard these stories about building statues out of this player, by the time his career is done, that he could, potentially hoist Stanley Cups here and so on and so forth. You and I were there, Ken, when he was part of the group that unveiled the Dale Hawerchuk statue. And I know that you'd said at that time afterwards, the look on his face, the way that he took part in that's something that resonates with a player like that. And here's something I think that potentially resonates. And it is one thing that I thought when I thought that Mark Scheifele was at the end of his tenure with the Winnipeg Jets. If you take a look at where he is points-wise in his career, the guy who owns all the records for the offensive records for the Winnipeg Jets, that's Blake Wheeler, right? But if you take a look at as he has risen and he's past the Kovalchuks of the world and those kind of people, whatever, if you want to tie the organization one to the other, that's what you got to do. And what you've seen here is that, and this is what I've always thought, Blake Wheeler's going to go and he's going to set all these records. And then Mark Scheifele is going to come along after him and he's going to break them all. And I thought at some point, well, that's not going to happen anymore. It's the one really massive selling point that the Winnipeg Jets were able to offer Mark Scheifele that he couldn't get anywhere else. Mark Scheifele is not getting traded to the Buffalo, I'm just throwing names out, the Buffalo Sabres, the Dallas Stars, the Tampa Bay Lightning, the Anaheim Ducks, and ending up the franchise leader in goals, assists, and points. That is not happening. It's too late for that. That ship has sailed. But it looks to me like we are now directly heading on a path where that's where Mark Scheifele is going to be. And probably the only thing that could kind of erase that would be if Kyle Connor keeps going on the trajectory that he's on. And maybe Kyle Connor would end up ahead of Mark Scheifele. But it would take a lot of consistency. Like we said, Ken, Mark Scheifele has been one of the most consistent point per game scorers the NHL has seen over the last 10 years in this league. So that's how you get to a point where you put yourself in that position. And Mark Scheifele, if Connor Hellebuyck if Kyle Connor doesn't stay with the Winnipeg Jets or whatever, Mark Scheifele could end up being one of these guys who has his name on the list as an NHL franchise's leading scorer, leading goal scorer, leading assist man, whatever. And it could be that way for 10, 20, 30, 50 years. The way that you would have to basically find a player who's going to come into Winnipeg, have phenomenal success, do that consistently, and then do that from the time he's a young man until an old man by NHL standards, if Mark Scheifele decides to stay until the end of this contract, which would place him at 37 years old. The other thing I take away from this and the whole lifelong Jet thing, I really do think the idea of that and the romanticism of that is something that, makes its way into this organization right from the owner of this hockey team. Mark Chipman has a love affair with the team that he owns. And that love affair extends not just from when he bought it but from the WHA days and when he was a young man and a young kid who loved the Winnipeg Jets. That's been evident in the times that he's chatted with us during the Heritage Classic games. He loves the Winnipeg Jets. He loves the organization. He loves its history, all these kind of things. So the idea of having a player run through and do these kind of things is extremely, extremely romantic and something that Mark Chipman is all on board with. And if you take the idea of that And every time people kind of wonder why Kevin Cheveldayoff has had the length of tenure that he's had, a lot of people think, he'd be gone if he was in other cities, all these kind of things. Well, Mark Chipman wanted a team. He didn't want to retool. He didn't want to rebuild. He wanted to retool. Well, there's no quicker way to make sure that you are retooling than signing these two players. So that's done. The idea of a rebuild for now, for the immediate future, and probably for, the foreseeable future is over with this signing. So anyone who is hoping for that can throw that out. But just the idea of taking and like setting records and the romanticism of your first ever draft pick ending up being your franchise leader in scoring, you can't write this kind of stuff. Mark Chipman loves this kind of stuff, and his GM has gone out and made it happen for his owner.
Yeah, all fair points, Sean. I mean, the most important thing for the Jets right now is that they have a Vezina caliber goaltender locked up for the next 9 seasons, and they have a number 1 center locked up for the next 9 seasons. And just a quick thing here, just in terms of the salary, some people wondering, this is big for the Jets. This is first year of Hellebuyck's new deal, which kicks in next year at 31 years old. It includes a $5 million salary and a $5 million signing bonus. Year 2, $10 million salary. Year 3, $7.5 million. It's important to remember, full no move clause for this year, the last year of the deal, and the first 3 years of the new deal. I think it's modified for the last 4. But that salary in year 4, back to $10 million, then $9 million, then $7 million, then $6 million for that average of 8.5. We had a lot of debate over what the number would eventually be for Connor Hellebuyck. I thought it would have to start with a 9 in order for him to
I thought
here.
So too.
At one point, I wondered if it might be 9.5. The fact that the Jets were able to get him for 8.5, it's twofold. It's important in the short term. This is not only a boost for the organization, it's a boost for the fan base. It's a boost for the players in that room, Sean. We've talked so much about the uncertainty of these important players on the roster going into the year on expiring contracts. They still have some big contracts to get sorted out, whether that's Nino Niederreiter or Brendan Dillon or Dylan DeMello. This definitely brings up a big question about Laurent Brossoit following this year. I think that Brossoit is a perfect 1B for the Jets for this year. How many starts he gets, we'll see. But the thing is, the Jets have really stabilized 2 of the most important positions on the entire ice. And that's something that it's tough to do. We've seen it, Sean. In terms of free agency, the Jets have not been able to attract a number 1 defenseman like Alex Pietrangelo when he was an unrestricted free agent. They did sign one in Josh Morrissey, who left no doubt that he is a top pairing defenseman and a bona fide number 1. But when it came to after this season, or even if the Jets decided to move someone at the trade deadline, to move Scheifele, there was no clear-cut answer of who would be the number 1 center, and could that number 1 center be a point-per-game player right now? So is there a risk in signing a pair of 31-year-olds, or they will be 31 when the deals begin? 2 7-year deals? Of course there is. There's risk with every contract that's signed, especially someone in their early 30s getting 7 years. But what do we know about Mark Scheifele, Sean, after being around him since 2011? This guy takes incredible care of his body. Have there been some freak injuries? Of course they have. But in terms of him being in great shape at 35, 36, 37, 38, he's going to do everything in his power to be in that situation. Hellebuyck has been a workhorse. That is not to be debated. What can Hellebuyck benefit from? Playing 57 to 58 starts instead of 64 or 66? Absolutely, that's the case, and I suspect that will be the case, especially this year with Brossoit being here. But the Jets have really done a good job of locking up premier positions at reasonable numbers. Sean, we both thought at some point the Jets may have to get to double digits in salary, and they basically have kicked that down the road for I would even venture a guess that for a considerable amount of time, because most of their core pieces, yes, Kyle Connor will come up, I think, in 2 years, or sorry, it's Ehlers in 2 years, Connor in 3.
Yeah.
Either way, we would have thought if there was going to be a $10 million player, it was probably going to be Hellebuyck, and he's locked in at 8.5. Now, let's not kid ourselves. 59.5 million is no laughing matter when it comes to the salaries these guys have earned. What we know also, before I turn it back to you, Mark Scheifele, for a good chunk of the contract, felt that he was underpaid. Now he's back in line with what his peers have been getting, whether that's for point totals or, Bo Horvat would be one of the most recent examples of this. And Hellebuyck, most recent example was Sorokin, who was a couple years younger. But to keep Hellebuyck in, whether you can argue whether he's in his prime or not, but he's still providing prime level goaltending. So I think these are massive deals for the Jets. Now, they don't come without risk. Nobody's saying that. But the risk in having to replace players of that level outweighs the risk of not signing them at all. So at least that's where I sat down today. I mean, are they going to age perfectly? Probably not. But as the cap goes up, those numbers will be a little bit easier to absorb in the later years. And that's what the Jets are banking on. They're banking on these players to be stars for the next, whatever the number, let's say 5 to 6 years out of the 8 total.
So you touched on it there, Ken, about the way that Mark Scheifele takes care of himself. The one thing I would say about this, and I know there were a lot of people who, we saw the comments, the Blake wheelchairs and stuff like that in our comment section. I know a lot of people weren't happy with that, and the amount of money that he was getting towards his end of his contract, people thought it was problematic. But if you kind of took the contract out of it and considered what he'd accomplished in the years leading up to those last couple of years, if you take his time with the Winnipeg Jets as a whole, Blake Wheeler, the Jets more than got their value for what they paid for Blake. And now I'm talking about on-ice production. I'm not talking about culture and all those kind of things, because we know we've had those conversations before, and culture is going to be a conversation we have to get to before we shut this down here. But if you take a look at what he produced on the ice over the years, it would be hard to say anything other than that the Jets got really good value out of Blake Wheeler in his time here. I see this as a similar thing. Mark Scheifele, for the most part, has been highly underpaid throughout the duration of his career. I think Connor Hellebuyck for the last couple of years as well. I remember, I think it was on Sportsnet Radio 590 out of Toronto when Connor Hellebuyck signed his last contract, and them thinking it was a terrible contract. And I thought, are you kidding me? Like, this guy is, on his way up, and they caught him at this number. I think they absolutely stole him at that number. Connor Hellebuyck, for being one of the top 3 goaltenders in the world the last number of years, has been highly underpaid as well. The one thing that I think is really amazing about this with Kevin Cheveldayoff is that I personally believe that the vast majority of players who go through a contract where they feel they've been underpaid, and Connor Hellebuyck's contract was long enough. Mark Scheifele had a really, really long contract, and for a long time has felt like he has been underpaid, closer to a decade than 5 years. And I think that with players like that, there's a tendency to feel like they need to go and make up their money on their next contract. And to your point, for the amount he's producing, now people can get into arguments about, culture or how he's playing defense, but for the numbers that he is producing, Mark Scheifele is getting paid in line with what number one centers around the NHL who produce those kind of numbers get paid. No doubt about it. He is. This is not, but I'll look at it from the surface, this is not an overpay. Connor Hellebuyck is making, to your point, I would have thought that this number had to start in a 9, and that was him not going out trying to seek making up money that he felt he lost on his last contract. So I take a look at both these. I think that they're both really good numbers. Now, one of the things that I do think they take away from the Blake Wheeler experience, I think one of the things you can say about Blake Wheeler is he was very methodical in how he prepared for the game. And the way that he prepared for the game put him in a position where he was in fairly good health for a 37-year-old by the time his contract was done. The Winnipeg Jets take a look at that, and they take and assess the value that they got out of him, and they take a look at Mark Scheifele, and they say the same thing. This is a guy who's going out of his way to look after himself. One thing that I've learned from all the clients of Adam Oates, and that would be Blake Wheeler, that would be Mark Scheifele, is the first thing that I'm told that he teaches those players is how to avoid getting injuries. He says, you want to stack up good numbers over your career? Well, hey, Nick Ehlers is a perfect example of this. You want to stack up good numbers, you need to stay healthy to do it. So these are players who go to a guy who helps them in the offseason. And the first tenet of all his teachings is how to stay healthy, how to stay on the ice more often. So Mark Scheifele goes out with that mindset. He plays the game with an eye. It's not a passive thing. He's been able to be a fairly consistent player because he plays a style of game and plays a certain way with a mind towards not getting injured. Clearly, Connor Hellebuyck's preparation is absolutely phenomenal. So the Jets are taking a look at what they saw out of Blake Wheeler. They see the same things in players like this. So they think, we'll take that gamble. And here's the other part of this, people. If Mark Scheifele can continue producing points till he's 35 and Connor Hellebuyck can remain a good goalie until he's 35, and let's say there's a disastrous drop-off after that, and at the ages of 36 and 37, those players both really tail off. Well, if you're the Winnipeg Jets, because you stole, what was it, a 5-year contract, Ken, for Connor Hellebuyck? 5 years from Connor Hellebuyck, where you were paying him way less, $2 to $3 million less than what he probably would have been making on with any other team in any other contract if you take a look at him compared to his peers. And if you take a look at Mark Scheifele's time where he was not getting paid anywhere near what his production rate was, then you take a look at the years 36 and 37, and you say, okay, we lost there, but we won so much before their contract extensions. Who cares if we lose a little bit on the back end? Now, I know fans in that moment are going to care, and they're going to be really upset, especially if those contracts end up dragging the team down and they can't move those contracts. But this isn't the concern. You don't live your life out of fear of something that happens 6 or 7 years from now, a what if scenario. You go out and you take a look at the numbers that are producing. You make your best educated guess on how long those players will keep contributing. And I think if you take a look at it, I don't look at these contracts and say 7 years is a bad bet for these players. Will they be perfectly great and producing until they're 37? I'm not sure I say that, but I don't think this is a bad bet at all. I think it's a good bet as far as production for dollars.
Sure, and Hellebuyck's deal was a 6-year deal at $37 million. So I mean, like you said, that's found money. And Sean, here's the other part: in getting Hellebuyck at 8.5, the Jets can afford a $1.5 million backup, and then they still are only investing investing $10 million in 2 goalies. So that's still a pretty sound number, especially with the cap going up next year and beyond. So, yeah, I mean, this is the thing. There was never going to be a rebuild. That was clear. That was made clear to the players, I believe, before this training camp happened. So now the Jets have basically put their money where their mouth is and said, here, you aren't sure about us rebuilding or trying to win? Well, how about we just emptied the vault for 2 franchise players? So I think that's important on a number of levels, and I think that's a massive thing for the organization in terms of trying to inject some belief and hope from the fan base right now. So, now the next thing will be getting off to a good start. And as I mentioned, I think we've been talking about this for months, Sean. Nino Niederreiter is a guy who wants to be with the Winnipeg Jets. I think he's going to be a guy that could get an extension during the course of this year too. Brendan Dillon, I would put in that category also. And then we'll see what happens with Dylan DeMello. I mean, he is the most stable partner Josh Morrissey has had since playing on a pairing with Jacob Trouba. So at some point, they're going to be looking at those things as well. So in terms of the money, of course, I mean, we don't know exactly where the cap is going to be. Are those big tickets for guys that'll be in their mid to late 30s? Of course they are. But as you mentioned, I mean, Mark Scheifele was a point-per-game player for 6 years, and he's just coming off a 42-goal season. Sean, we talked about Mark's mentality going into this year, and we kind of had differing opinions on how he might handle it. Now there's nothing to handle except what happens on the ice. Mark's not worried about whether or not his agent has talked with Kevin Cheveldayoff in the last week or month. Now all he has to do is focus on playing hockey. We know there's parts of his game that he's always trying to improve, and the one that has to improve the most is defense. Like, this is not rocket science. But in terms of the production he's been able to deliver, it's hard to argue with that. And you can't argue with it because it has been great for him. Now it allows him to just go out and play hockey. And, we debated about the captaincy thing and whatever else, but I mean, Mark's still a part of the leadership core, and now he will continue to be for as long as he's here. And I think that that'll be right till the end of this contract.
Okay. I want to say I think we've been fairly positive with this whole thing. There's a lot of reason to be positive. I think we touched on all those things, but sometimes the conversations get a little bit stanky out of this, because there are things about this. We are talking about a team that these are two of the very core central players on this team that has really stalled, and over the last number of years really been spinning its wheels. And the one thing I take a look at when I see this is, you and I talked about this before the show came on. You believe that this is going to be a 7-8 team that's going to make the playoffs. I believe that this is going to be
third in the Central now. So
so you've moved up. So he's locked it up. Ken is moving them up the dial.
Out of the wild card and into third. Yeah, there you go.
Ken's got a lot more faith than I do, because I've got this team placed at around 9th, 10th is where I have them. And I made that with the assumption that Connor Hellebuyck and Mark Scheifele were going to be Winnipeg Jets for the entire season. The Winnipeg Jets, as exciting as this signing is for a lot of people, are no better today than they were yesterday. It's the same thing, other than maybe you clear the deck of the big question hanging over the team and you just allow things to go. But the assumption should be that these are pros and they should be able to play their way around that anyways. But I want to get to that conversation and where this leaves them. First, I just want to make sure I give a shout out to Vittorio Rossi, Trans-Canada Brewing Company, the Johnston Group, the Keg, Pristine Roofing, and Cambrian Credit Union. And we are delighted to say home field is back for the ride this year as well. We are going to get a little bit more official with our advertisements, obviously, as we go on, because we have a lot of fun and lots of really fun stuff to announce that we will be unveiling after the very first post-game Kenny and Renny show. That will be just 2 days from now on Wednesday, and we'll be in Calgary for that. But let's get down to it. I want to take a crack at this, Ken, and say, and I'm just going to make a statement. Just basically what I said before this. The Winnipeg Jets are no better today than they were a day ago. And whether or not you think they're going to finish third, whether or not I think they're going to miss the playoffs, the very fact of the matter is these two players were around for last season, where they went crashing out of the playoffs in a very, ugly way that became very public with their coach. They had a huge fall during the season that these two players were right in the middle of. The season before that, these two players were right there, right at the center of this when they missed the playoffs. And for the seasons before that, they were right there as this team stock dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped every year after 2018. So from the pessimistic point of view, Ken, for the fan out there who's saying, and there's some of them, I think I've got a good one right here. Rob Mahoney says, this just cements the Jets in the mushy middle. Chevy sees no need to improve the talent level of the team. Now there's 20% of future cap room that a new GM can't use. Bailey, the official intern of the Kenny and Renny Show of Winnipeg Sports, talking of a legal curve, says, do we think Scheifele's defense will improve at all throughout the 7 years? With a smiley face, I think she's basically trying to say, look, we locked up a guy who's been a defensive problem. And let's be honest, Ken, a lot of people were calling for Scheifele to be sent out of town before this. So for those people who are saying right now, great, we've just continued living in this place that is make the playoffs, don't make the playoffs, fall years before that. Why should today's decision give those fans hope?
Well, I mean, I would also counter, I mean, everything that you said is accurate. I would say that the flip side of that coin would be that when the Jets enjoyed their biggest amount of success in the 2018 playoffs, Mark Scheifele was the undisputed champion during that time. 16 goals, 20 points. Was more than a point a game player, and for all the people that joke about empty net goals, Mark scored big goal after big goal in those series as they advanced to the Western Conference Final. Now, I know where we've debated plenty about the playoff workload for Connor Hellebuyck, but Connor has been between the pipes when the Jets have enjoyed their greatest successes as well. And that means posting a franchise best record where they were second overall behind the Nashville Predators, and he had a heavy workload that year as well. The bigger thing for me, and when it comes to this playoff success or lack thereof since 2018, Connor Hellebuyck, because Laurent Brossoit is here, will have the opportunity to help keep Connor Hellebuyck fresh, so that he won't have to make 13 consecutive starts down the stretch and then be maybe potentially out of gas, even though nobody wanted to admit it in the playoffs last year. When it comes to Scheifele, his seasons have not ended well. We had a reminder of that last week in the preseason game against the Ottawa Senators. One of the seasons that ended early was when he got rocked by Parker Kelly. Parker Kelly took a run at him late in a lopsided game. Mark didn't like it. He went after him, and he made sure that he knew that he didn't appreciate said run at him. Does Mark need to stay on the ice? He can't be suspended. He can't be injured when the Jets need him most. That's obvious. But in Mark's absence, Sean, I would argue that nobody has stepped up to anywhere near the level that someone needs to play at in order to fill a number one center job. So if you don't have an alternative to the number one center who has produced at a high level, why not sign the number one center? I mean, there isn't a ton on the free agent market unless the Jets were able to find the next number one center. We talked a lot about this when it came to the summer negotiations with the New Jersey Devils. And I'm not even certain Dawson Mercer's a number one center, but I think he could have grown into a first-line role, whether that was at center or a wing. If you can't find a number one center in a trade when potentially a elite-level goaltender and a number one center are there, then you have to either draft one in the top 5 or 10 or hope that you can sign a free agent. And I don't see the level of free agent. Like, if the Jets could sign a number one center, well, then you could make the argument maybe they looked for an upgrade. But it's hard to find an upgrade on the offensive side of things. And I'm not ignoring the defensive shortcomings for Mark Scheifele. There are very few Elias Lindholms out there. So lots of teams have guys who don't provide Selke-level defensive play at the center position. I expect Mark to be better in that position. He was better at it for a good chunk of last year. I didn't see nearly as many flybys, and now it's up to him to take the next step because now he's getting paid. Now he doesn't have to worry about having to score 50 in order to make money. He's making money. Now go out and be a better 200-foot player, still be a productive 200-foot, be a productive player, but be a productive 200-foot player. And now it's up to Mark, because what we know about Mark, he pushes himself, he wants to be better, and nobody more than Mark Scheifele wants the 2017-18 playoff version of Mark Scheifele to arrive this season at what is basically a crossroads for where the organization wants to be heading. I mean, do the Jets need to be better? Of course they do. But I also think that a better supporting cast, Sean, will allow Mark to be better as well. Because they have a better supporting cast, there will be other players on the ice protecting one-goal leads at times. And that's also important when it comes to having Alex Iafallo going out with Adam Lowry, and you want to put a second center out there, a guy that can take draws. If you have Vlad Nemestikov, whether you have Mark Scheifele, I think he will be put in a better position to succeed because the talent around him, again, I'm not arguing against the talent. Pierre-Luc Dubois and Blake Wheeler were talented people, and they certainly were. Blake was a very talented and very impactful player in that 2017-18 playoff as well, but Mark was the trigger man during that stretch. And now it's up to him to get back to that level. So, that's on the player right now. And in terms of Hellebuyck, he doesn't want to hear all of the noise about, one playoff series win since 2017-18 either. So that's on him to continue to play at a high level and elevate when the games matter the most, because he said it nonstop. He wants to, his only concern now is winning a Stanley Cup, and now it's up to him to go out and try to win that Stanley Cup.
I have to say, when I think about this entire thing, one thing I feel very confident that the Jets need some way is change, right? And this is the exact opposite of change. And so I do agree with you. You've chosen your horses, right? So the Winnipeg Jets now at the very center of you is Connor Hellebuyck and Mark Scheifele, and it's going to remain that way by the looks of it for a very, very long time. We've seen enough from them for me to know like what to expect from those players. I do know that a lot of the times that Scheifele has succeeded, the defense hasn't necessarily been there, but even that, we've had that conversation on this show before, Ken. The idea that we used to do these stories on Hockey Night in Canada year after year after year, where this massive number, 7 or 8 of the Winnipeg Jets would be having career years, and yet the house was falling down around them. Everyone individually was succeeding. They hadn't been able to put it together as a team. I had thought that Rick Bowness would be the change that was required to maybe get these guys playing a little bit differently. I'm going to share a little bit of a conversation that I had with someone from inside the room about the idea that there was a belief there that, yes, they tried to move on from the effect of Blake Wheeler by taking the C off him last year. And that person said to me, you just can't do it with that player still there, right? As much as you want to, that player is still there. The routines are still in place. He may not have a C, but sitting in that same stall, old habits kind of fall into place. And I think when the Jets had so much success out of the gate last year, everything was new and it was working. But then as everything started falling apart, I think they went back to their old ways. Rick Bowness said they went back to the way that they used to play. I think that they, from what I'm hearing from inside the room, they went back to some of the old things, and that kind of had Blake Wheeler reemerging as one of the kind of leaders in that room. It's going to be interesting to see with him gone, the effect that Rick Bowness can have, because we saw what this team looked like under Rick Bowness when they played the way Rick Bowness wanted them to play. It was a hardworking team that played the right style of game, created opportunities off of good defense, which you've heard Rick Bowness saying that they want them back doing that. But it's just it's so hard to look at this team and this deal and just be overjoyed and have this a massive amount of faith, because can you believe that the Jets can be and continue to be their version of themselves from the beginning of the year last year, where Rick Bowness turned them into what he was looking for? Or are they just always going to revert to what they happened at the end of the year, where Rick Bowness had said they really just fell back into their old habits? Basically, all the things that had plagued them at the tail end of the Paul Maurice years came back to plague them last year. Rick Bowness has said he's seen a year of it. He thinks he knows how to handle it. He thinks he knows when to jump on top, but he feels like he didn't jump on top of it fast enough. But that is the massive question right now. Is Mark Scheifele going to be able to be shown a different way, and is he going to go down that different way? And for me, this is the point I kind of want to get to and have you kind of respond to. For me, a lot of this is about culture, right? I think the culture is something that we've talked about over the years. It's what I hear behind the scenes. It's what I'm talking about when I say last year that the Jets were kind of moved on. Then they had trouble and they started going back to their old ways, and a belief within the dressing room from some people that I talked to that you really couldn't move on from Blake Wheeler with him in the room. He's out of the room now. Can they make that culture shift? Because here's the interesting part of it, Ken. The Jets have locked down on 2 guys who, we've talked about it on this podcast, really went to the school of Blake Wheeler when it comes to leadership. And I don't think that these guys, if you had asked them at any point, ever have thought that the Jets have had a culture issue. So if they do have a culture issue, and it's what Rick Bowness said when he walked in, he was like taking on culture issues. I don't think publicly, maybe they believe so behind the scenes and just don't want to say it out loud, but I don't think publicly either Mark Scheifele or Connor Hellebuyck have ever said anything about thinking the Jets have a culture issue. And that to me becomes the biggest challenge, because I think if the Winnipeg Jets are going to change their fortunes from what has been happening over the last number of years, that culture has to change. And they just lock down two guys who've never said anything or any worries about the culture and are going to be, no matter what you say or do, these two guys are going to be culture carriers in this Jets dressing room. And the question is, can the Jets get to a culture that starts bringing results and resembles the talent that they have? Or did these guys make it less likely, these guys re-signing make it less likely that that's going to happen?
Yeah, one quick thing. I mean, we've been talking about Kevin Cheveldayoff in half measures for a lot of years during his 13-year tenure. This is an all-in move by the general manager. This isn't a wait and see. This isn't a kick the can down the road. This is going all in, and the next moves will follow that. So is it going to be up to the players to show that they can take a new direction? Of course. In terms of culture, Sean, I mean, all the stuff that we talked about and debated over the years, we didn't talk about any of those things in 2017-18 when the Jets were winning. So at one point, those guys were good leaders for the time. And at the time now, the Jets needed a new leadership core, and they have a new captain in Adam Lowry, and he will be supported by a player who's been here since 2011 in Mark Scheifele. So it's easy for us to debate, but the only thing that really matters, Sean, it's not what we think or what the fan base thinks. It's what the people inside the room think. And if those players thought it was a concern, those expressions would have been made to the general manager in exit meetings, in my humble opinion. And if those things had been said, then I don't think that they would make this kind of a commitment to either one of these players. So, I mean, they're going to have to show it. I mean, it's all about how they show it on and off the ice. I don't see there being a culture issue. I mean, you talked about Rick Bowness and the effect he had. Yes, would we be talking differently if they did not collapse down the stretch? Of course, but you can't ignore the fact what the Jets were able to do in that 4-month period where they were the top team in the in the Central Division and the Western Conference. So, can they get back to that level? That's up to them. And winning teams have a good culture. That's basically where it is. I mean, when we talk about accountability, there's Rob Mahoney. Leaders hold themselves accountable. I mean, the Jets are going to need to be more accountable. And Sean, what Rick Bowness said and what he didn't say in terms of what he learned about his team and didn't want to share with the media when he was grilled about it was that he needs his players to be more accountable, and he plans to hold them more accountable. That's the message that I heard from the unsaid words. And I think these players, they know that. I mean, Connor Hellebuyck's a guy who has given the Jets everything that he had. So now he's going to have to continue to do that as he gets into his early to mid to late 30s. Mark Scheifele knows what was at stake for him. Now it's about legacy building. There's no question about, if he has a bad year, it impacts his legacy. Well, he's going to have 7 years to build on his legacy, and now it's up for him to take care of that side of it. Like I said, I think the 1 year when we talked all about ruffled feathers and whatever else, I don't want people to be happy when they're losing. I hope that people are pissed off when they're not playing well or losing. But now, how do you handle yourself when the chips are down and when things aren't going as well? That is what we didn't like from the Jets last year down the stretch. Now it's up to those players to take their part. We know they're part of the leadership group. Rick Bowness has said this. Rick Bowness had Roberto Luongo as his captain when he was an assistant with Vancouver. He values Connor Hellebuyck's opinion. He obviously values Mark Scheifele's opinion, or he would have taken him out of the leadership group this year. So does that mean they're perfect leaders? Of course not. Those are few and far between, but I don't think that management or the coaching staff or the players themselves are concerned about what Mark Scheifele or Connor Hellebuyck are going to bring to the table. And I'm doubling down on what I said earlier. For the Jets to get back to being good, it was going to be a lot harder to get good without Connor Hellebuyck and Mark Scheifele than it is going to be with them in the fold, especially when you consider Rutger McGroarty, Colby Barlow, and all the other people who will follow behind them, whether that's Elias Solomonson or Dom DiVincentis eventually.
No doubt. Ken, I think we should shut this down. You've got family things that you got to take care of. I've got flights that I need to prepare for and get ready for as I'm doing this out of the Toronto airport. Want to thank everyone for jumping in on this. I want to end just with a quick thought on this entire thing. I'd been saying it for a long time about Mark Scheifele, that careful what you wish for the many people who had called to have him move. That's a lot of offense out of the lineup, and players like that don't come along very often. So I think that this is, if you take a look at this is a no-brainer from the offensive side of things. Like, you keep a player like this, again, I think that the contract lines up for it. Defensively, I'm in agreement with the people who are talking about how he played defense earlier in his career. I thought Mark Scheifele was a fairly sound centerman, and things seem to kind of tail off over these last number of years, creating defensive issues that we all know have been problematic. So we know where he's been. We know what he's capable of. To me, this is all about getting back to those capabilities. And there's plenty of points that have been made. A lot of people made this point. I started this one by Kim Sawchuk, who says it takes more than a year to right the ship. I'm all about that. It is basically what is being preached by Rick Bowness right now. The Jets culture is something that we've been talking about for years. For it to turn around in 1 year, it was amazing, honestly, Ken, that if the Jets just would have kept doing what they did in the first 4 months of the season last year and just stormed through the entire year playing the way Rick Bowness had them playing, for them to have turned the corner on that culture as quickly as they did would have been absolutely astounding. It very much looks, and I think we can all say, I'm not even going to speculate or anything like that. I don't think it's speculation. When you've got the season ending as it did last year with a head coach calling out his team and his team fighting their coach in the media, that was a SHIT show of an epic sort that we witnessed last year. That kind of stuff doesn't happen unless there's culture issues that need to be got through. If the idea is that Rick Bowness is the man for the job, and last year was a step forward, maybe 2 steps forward and then 1 step back, and maybe we could say it was that, because they did get better. They made the playoffs. So let's say it was that last year. Rick Bowness's year with the Jets was 2 steps forward, or maybe 3 steps forward the way it was looking, and then 2 steps back. But in order for this deal to shake out, for these 2 players who are at the nucleus of a Winnipeg Jets team, 2 players who are undoubtedly phenomenal hockey players, but have been in the middle of a leadership group that has suffered, the culture issues that we've seen and suffered a lack of results and team success over the years, that to me is the key. There needs to be a culture turnaround, and it can't be what the Jets have tried to do for years, Ken. What have they done? We'll go get Nate Schmidt. We'll go get Brendan Dillon. We'll go get these super high character players in, and we'll surround the nucleus with these super high character guys, and that will fix everything and permeate into the middle. It hasn't worked like that. You need to make sure that the nucleus of your team is reached. And in order for this deal to work out and be beneficial and the proper deal for the Winnipeg Jets, Rick Bowness or whoever comes after him is going to have to find a way to reach these players and get the culture right at the center of the Winnipeg Jets room for this to turn out and to be a grand slam deal. If he can, this is a phenomenal day for Winnipeg Jets fans. And regardless to say the Winnipeg Jets, if you were never a fan of the rebuild, then the retool there's no other way to go right now for the foreseeable future. So I want to say thank you for everyone for joining in. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody. And again, just want to give a shout out to Vittorio Rossi, TransCanada Brewing Company, the Kenny and Renny OGs at the Johnson Group, Home Field, who is back on board for another season, the Keg and Pristine, who are taking their first full run of the season with Kenny and Renny, and of course Cambrian Union. Thank you, Cambrian Credit Union. You know what I always say, if you appreciate the content that is happening in these spaces, and that's with us, that shows like Winnipeg Sports Talk, that shows like A Legal Curve, please support the sponsors who are keeping these conversations going in these spaces. We appreciate them to no end. Thank you so much. Thanksgiving to everybody, and we will see you after the game on Wednesday.
The Kenny and Renny Show is brought to you by Home Field. Cambrian Credit Union, Lou Ferlin, Trans-Canada Brewing, Vittorio Rossi, and Johnston Group.